There are then four parallel arguments in Aristotle. One, a sequence of efficient causes can't be backwards infinite. There has to be a first cause. And that indeed is reflected in the first way as well. We can think of the causes as motions or changes and say that just as that sequence of motions or changes cannot go back infinitely, there must be a prime mover. Then we can do the same thing with final causes, and here we see the argument that underlies the beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics. A sequence of final causes can't be infinite either. That means there must be a final cause. And finally, formal causes, going upwards as it were, the way I've been visualizing this, the idea is this. Then we're going to be able to say, look, that can't go on infinitely either. We must be able to get to the most fundamental, the most revealing, the truest sense of what the essence or form or structure of something is. Well, when Aristotle presents that sort of argument with respect to formal causes, he talks about essences and definitions. Aquinas gives it a slightly different spin in his commentary on the metaphysics. He says, finally, that is to say, Aristotle mentions the formal cause. He says it's also impossible to proceed to infinity in the case of the quiddity, the formal cause, which the definition signifies. However, he omits examples, because these are evident, and it was shown in Book 1 of the Posterior Analytics that it's impossible to proceed to infinity in the matter of predication. Now, I think here he must mean Section 3 of Book 1 of the Posterior Analytics. Some hold that owing to the necessity of knowing the primary premises, there's no scientific knowledge. Others think there is, but that all truths are demonstrable. Neither doctrine is true, or a necessary deduction from the premises. Why? Well, the first school, assuming there is no way of knowing other than by demonstration, maintained that an infinite regress is involved, on the ground that if behind the prior stands no primary, we couldn't know the posterior through the prior. If, on the other hand, they say, the series terminates in their primary premises, yet these are unknowable because incapable of demonstration, which according to them is the only form of knowledge. There is something like this argument right at the end of Plato's Theaetetus, and so it's an epistemological version of this argument that Aristotle is aware of, and that intriguingly, when he talks about formal causes, he appeals to. So suddenly, he's saying, look, we already did this in the Posterior Analytics with respect to this question of justification, of argument, of providing a reason for thinking something. Well, transfer that epistemological point over to the notion of formal causes, and you can see in the metaphysics Aristotle doing something slightly different, but based on the same idea. Here, instead of thinking of premises from which we can derive a conclusion, we're thinking of terms which we can use to define our basic terms. Now, before looking at the details of how this argument might go, I want to make one quick observation. Aristotle throws in a point that is intriguing, I think, from a contemporary technical point of view, that Aquinas omits. Aristotle's premise in these arguments is actually slightly stronger than the premise used by Aquinas. He says that a sequence of causes can't be backwards infinite, nor, he says, can it be infinitely various in kind. What does he have in mind? I think he has in mind what is today called Koenig's lemma. That is to say that any infinite tree has to have either an infinite branch or has to have a node at which infinitely many branches depart. Well, Aristotle is aware of both, and he's using here as a premise that actually a causal tree, if you want to think of tracing the various causes of something back, it shouldn't be really viewed as a line, but something like a tree, since something might have more than one cause contributing to it. But the tree is something that has to be a finite tree. That means all branches have to be finite, but also all the branchings, all the nodes have to be such that only finitely many branches come from them. Now, Aquinas sees, I think, that if he's interested in establishing the existence of a first cause in any of the four senses, he doesn't really need to worry about the infinite branching. He doesn't, in other words, need to assume that it's a finite tree. He just needs finite branches in order to get back there. I'm not sure he's entirely right about that. We've talked about the problem of getting the various strands together and getting from something existing outside the initial domain we start with, the natural domain, for example, this world of sense, and so on, to one thing that's out there, exactly one, rather than at least one. And if we've got now the potential for infinitely many of those, you might think that's a little scarier than just finitely many. Can we use the same technique that we might be able to use to collapse finitely many into one for the infinite case and use it to collapse infinitely many things into one? Perhaps we can, and actually I think Aquinas thinks we can. It's really his argument about the simplicity of God that does it, and there could be infinitely many analogues, you might say, to the one property that is the true property of God. So I'm going to put that aside, but at least I think it's interesting that Aristotle has that full strength of Koenig's lemma in mind. Both Aristotle and Aquinas separate the cases of an infinite branch in the sense of infinitely many different nodes on the branch from the case of a loop, the case of a cycle. They're right to draw the distinction, even though we can cover both with one principle, as I did in reconstructing this, and as set theorists, for example, routinely do in adopting an axiom of foundations. Nevertheless, you can distinguish them. In set theory, Peter Axel has shown that there are at least two ways of constructing an anti-foundational set theory, where in one case you allow loops, in the other case you allow infinite descending chains but no loops. Of course, you might allow both. Now, I think that's an interesting thought, but for our present purposes, we're not going to really worry about that distinction. What I want to focus on instead is something else going on here. Here seems to be the idea in Aristotle and in Aquinas' commentary. A sequence of essences, of definitions, of quiddities can't be backwards infinite, can't be going from these terms to even more fundamental terms to even more fundamental terms and so on infinitely. At some point we come to the primitives. We come to the indefinable things, the unanalyzable things, in terms of which other things get explained. Well, similarly you might think, in thinking of good qualities, and here we bring it home to the fourth way, like goodness, or greatness, or wisdom, or other excellences of God, you might think the same thing happens. In general, with perfections, we can't have degrees of perfection going on infinitely. There must be a maximal point of those degrees of perfection. So there must be some point at which the perfections terminate in a most perfect thing. And that, of course, is going to be identified with God. So we could look at it this way. A sequence of perfections can't be upwards, if you want to think of it that way, upwards infinite. It must come to a maximum point. That maximum point is the maximally perfect thing, and that is God. I think this is a little tricky. What allows us to do it? Part of it is that if we're trying to think about the relationship between a thing and something prior to it, that assumption that Aquinas makes, that the thing that is prior really is the more fundamental thing. It is, in some sense, causally prior. It is, well, in the case of a perfection, not just better than, but in a certain fundamental sense prior to that thing. So the maximal perfect thing, the maximum, the most perfect thing, that is in some way the most fundamental. That really is the causal source of all the perfections. Now, I think we have to be careful here, because do we really want to say that all the way up? This thing at this degree of perfection, it derives its perfection from this thing a little better? That seems like a strange thing to say. And notice that Aquinas doesn't actually say that in the fourth way. He just uses this with respect to the maximum. So I think that's related to his point, reading Aristotle closely, that wait, it shouldn't make any difference whether the intermediates are one or many, even infinitely many. Eventually, he says, we've got to get to a maximum point. And really, it's that maximum point, the one that is most fundamental, from which everything else on that scale derives. So we end up saying everything derives its goodness from that maximal perfection. Well, we can turn all of these arguments into formally valid arguments, as we've done before. A non-emptiness premise, saying there is a non-empty domain of the range of whatever our relation R is. Here the relation of cause, but in any of those four directions. And also this relation of more perfect than, for example. Then finiteness, which is the transitive closure of causation, cannot be backwards infinite. And finally, that allows us to show there is a first cause in either the efficient or the formal or the material or the final sense outside that domain we started with. Well, if we apply that to the fourth way, we get something interesting. We get a non-emptiness premise in the natural world. Some things are less perfect than others. Seriality premise within the natural world. Everything is less perfect than something. You can keep going up and imagine something better and better. Finiteness, but more perfect can't be more words infinite. When we think about things being on the scale of perfection, we realize this can't go up forever and ever. It's got to get to a maximally perfect point. And conclusion, there is a supernatural perfect being. That seems like a pretty solid argument based on this. It's one that does a lot to tell us something important about what the fourth way is doing. But if we compare it to Aquinas' fourth way, there's an important element that's being left out. And it's that idea of causal priority, the idea that it's really the maximum that is causally prior to everything else, from which everything else derives. So here's how I will try to reconstruct the argument as Aquinas sees it. We start again with the same non-emptiness premise. In the natural world, some things are less perfect than others. Seriality. Everything in the natural world is imperfect. There's always something more perfect. Finiteness. More perfect isn't more words infinite. We can't go infinitely far in the direction of perfection. We get to a maximally perfect being. Then a principle of causal dependence. The prior, as Aristotle puts it, must be the cause of the later terms. Anything perfect to a less than maximal degree depends for its being and perfection on that maximally perfect thing. Conclusion then, well, there is a supernatural, most perfect being, and everything else derives its being and perfection from that being. So everything in the natural world, with any degree of perfection at all, derives its being and perfection from the maximally perfect being, namely God. Well, we're still vulnerable to objections, not only to the finiteness principle, but also to that causal dependence principle. We might worry about getting existence and perfection together in a way, at least, that isn't going to commit us to the validity of Anselm's ontological argument, and Aquinas doesn't want to be committed to that. We might also worry about the various perfections. Aquinas doesn't simply talk about perfection in the argument. He talks about goodness. He talks about wisdom. He talks about a variety of different perfections. And so how do we get them all together? We should worry about that. Well, I mentioned at the outset, I can't really get this to work for the fifth way. I'm not going to go through now my various attempts. You can construct an argument based on final causes, but on the other hand, that gives you something like the opening sections of the Nicomachean Ethics, where there is one final cause, most final cause, namely their happiness. It doesn't give you an initial purpose giver to the universe. It doesn't seem to give you God as creator or designer or architect or any of those other kinds of things. So that doesn't seem to work. Suppose we take the final cause in the other direction, thinking, well, it's typically a person who directs events toward a final cause, so let's push in the other direction, not toward the final cause, but toward the origin of this, toward the ultimate director of the universe. That seems more promising. But then I can't get it to work given his distinction between intelligent and non-intelligent beings. Roughly speaking, the best I can do is where it ends up that any intelligent being ends up being an ultimate director of the universe, or an ultimate director of something at any rate, some part of the universe. So we'll postpone that for further research. I want to close, though, with one final thought. And that is, not only does looking at Metaphysics Book 2 give us a way of trying to understand what Aquinas is up to generally in the five ways, but it also maybe gives us an insight into what he's doing with the structure of the five ways themselves. Because if you think about what's happening there, we've been worried about this problem of how to get the various causes, the various movers, the various things together. Each argument seems to give us at least one supernatural first cause. But we want exactly one of all of those things, and we want them all to be the same. What if Aquinas is thinking in each case that these arguments build on one another? So we start out getting a prime mover, and then a creator of the universe. And then we put on top of that an argument that there is moreover at least one that is serving as a ground of being, and then at least one that is serving as a kind of, you might say, ultimate perfection of the universe. And then the fifth way would be saying, and there is somebody directing all of this. And suppose each is meant to build on the others. So we're really meant to say something like, look, one of those guys, right? One of those is doing this. Well, again, why just one? Maybe it doesn't solve the problem at all. But I think the entire pattern of the 5 ways is to do something like what Paul does in Acts 17, to say that actually we need one being who is going to be ultimate efficient cause, ultimate final cause, ultimate material cause, ultimate formal cause of the universe. What could be like that? Perhaps indeed what ties it all together is the 4th way. There is a maximally perfect being that makes it maximally powerful, maximally good, maximally fundamental, maximally perfect.